The man behind the wheel. It was an unusually quiet morning in Mountain View, California. The sky, painted in soft tones of orange and pink, hinted at a peaceful start to the day. Sundar Pichai, CEO of Alphabet Inc., was behind the wheel of a sleek, black Tesla Model S. Unlike most of his days filled with meetings, interviews, and strategy sessions, this day was his alone. He had taken the morning off to reflect, to reconnect with a part of himself that often got buried beneath layers of responsibility and schedules. Dressed in a plain navy blue t-shirt and faded jeans, with his signature glasses perched comfortably on his nose, Sundar didn't look anything like the public figure the world admired. He didn't want to. There was a certain joy in anonymity. As he drove toward the nearby neighborhood where he had once lived when he first moved to the United States, memories flooded back, memories of struggle, of learning, of resilience. The battered roads of his early days still existed, untouched by time, as though waiting for him to return and remember who he once was. He turned the car into a quiet street lined with modest houses and aging trees. His destination wasn't a meeting or a conference. It was a small coffee shop owned by a retired Indian couple who had once given him free chai when he was just a broke student with dreams bigger than his wallet. They had no idea who he had become, and he never told them. He liked it that way. To them, he was just Sunny, a soft-spoken young man with curious eyes and a polite smile. Just as he pulled into a parking spot across the street from the cafe, he noticed flashing red and blue lights in the rearview mirror. A police cruiser rolled up behind him, and the officer inside stepped out purposefully. Sundar felt a slight knot form in his stomach, not because he had done anything wrong, but because he knew that look. The officer was approaching with a mindset already made. Up. The tall, broad-shouldered man in uniform, Officer Raymond Carter, was walking toward him briskly, one hand resting near his holster. Sundar rolled down his window calmly. "Good morning, officer," he said, his voice composed. The officer didn't return the greeting. He glanced at the car's sleek dashboard, then at Sundar. "License and registration." Sundar complied immediately. "May I ask what this is about?" he inquired gently. "This car matches the description of a vehicle recently reported stolen," Officer Carter replied curtly. "And you don't look like you belong in it." There it was, the unspoken assumption, the silent judgment. Sundar remained calm. "This is my vehicle. I can show you proof of ownership." But the officer didn't seem interested. He gestured for Sundar to step out of the car. Several bystanders had started gathering, their curious eyes reflecting confusion and growing concern. Some recognized Sundar instantly. A couple of them even began recording on their phones. Sundar complied without resistance. He wasn't just thinking about his own safety. He was thinking about the example he needed to set. He knew this wasn't just about him anymore. "I'll need to check the VIN number," the officer said, walking around the car. Sundar took a deep breath. "You're welcome to do so, but I'd appreciate if we could maintain professionalism. I haven't done anything wrong. Just doing my job," Carter muttered. Inside the coffee shop, Mrs. Patel looked through the window and her eyes widened. "That's Sunny," she gasped. Her husband rushed out, walking straight toward the commotion. "Officer, this man is not a thief. He's a good man. We know him." The officer hesitated. "Do you know his full name?" "Yes," Mrs. Patel replied proudly. Sundar Pichai." A ripple of recognition spread through the small crowd. Someone whispered, "That's the CEO of Google." Another person added, "Why would he steal a car? That's his car." Officer Carter looked back at Sundar with a sudden shift in expression. The wheels in his mind began to turn, slowly catching up with the reality in front of him. But Sundar said nothing. He wasn't angry, but there was a quiet hurt in his eyes that spoke louder than any words. After a brief pause, Officer Carter cleared his throat. "You're free to go. Sorry for the misunderstanding." Sundar nodded and offered a small forgiving smile. "It happens." But as he turned to leave, a young boy from the crowd called out, "Why didn't you yell at him? He was wrong." Sundar turned to the boy. He knelt to his level and said, "Sometimes the best way to teach is not by yelling, but by showing a better way." That moment was captured on camera. It would later go viral, sparking conversations across the nation. But more importantly, it sparked something in Officer Carter too. He stood there, watching Sundar disappear into the coffee shop with the old couple, and for the first time in a long while, he questioned the assumptions that came too easily to him. Inside, over steaming cups of chai, Sundar listened to Mr. Patel's jokes and Mrs. Patel's loving scolding, as if the world outside had never changed. But something had changed, something that would carry forward into a greater story, one that would challenge perceptions, heal wounds, and inspire people across the globe to see beyond appearances. It was the beginning of a quiet revolution, not with anger, not with protests, but with the graceful defiance of one man choosing dignity over rage, forgiveness over pride, and kindness over judgment. The officer's dilemma, Raymond Carter sat at the edge of his neatly made bed that evening, staring at a digital frame on his nightstand where photos of his family flickered every few seconds. His daughter in her graduation gown, his son grinning with a fishing rod, and his wife smiling by the lake. All snapshots of a life that felt solid and sure. But tonight, as the familiar scenes scrolled before his tired eyes, none of them could quiet the storm brewing inside him. The incident with Sundar Pichai played on repeat in his mind, not because of the social media outrage that had already begun, nor the reprimanding tone of his sergeant who had called within hours, but because of the man himself. Sundar had not yelled, had not even frowned in disappointment. Instead, he'd spoken with a quiet clarity that felt more cutting than any angry words ever could. Sometimes the best way to teach is not by yelling, but by showing a better way. That line echoed through Raymond's thoughts like a bell ringing at the core of his conscience. He had made assumptions before. Every officer had. You were trained to be cautious, to assess, to act quickly. But somewhere along the line, that training had become tinted with prejudice, fed by years of reinforced stereotypes and a system that encouraged suspicion more than understanding. Raymond wasn't a bad man. He'd grown up in a small town in Arkansas, raised by God-fearing, hard-working parents who believed in fairness, but also in keeping to your own. His upbringing had taught him strength and respect, but not always empathy. As a police officer, he'd seen the worst in people: liars, thieves, gang members, addicts. And sometimes he'd stopped seeing individuals and started seeing categories. That day when he saw Sundar in a luxury car, dressed simply, relaxed and calm, something in his instincts, his flawed instincts, had clicked to attention. Doesn't look like he belongs. That voice in his head had guided his action, and now he couldn't silence it. Raymond woke early the next morning, his badge heavy in his pocket and his spirit heavier still. Something in him knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary day. After his shift started, he reviewed the body cam footage from the previous day, not because he had to, but because he needed to confront it. Watching himself question Sundar, seeing the subtle shift in the crowd, hearing that little boy's question, it was a mirror he couldn't turn away from. For the first time in years, Raymond saw the shadow of something ugly and unnamed, lurking quietly behind his own voice. Meanwhile, across town, Sundar Pichai was sitting in a quiet conference room at the Googleplex, but his mind wasn't on the quarterly updates being presented on the large display. He had requested a lighter schedule today, not because of what had happened, but because of what it had stirred in him. There was an old weight on his shoulders, the weight of 1,000 quiet injustices faced by people who didn't have cameras around, who didn't have the privilege of forgiveness being amplified by the media. He'd received dozens of messages since the video went viral. Celebrities applauded his calm, activists praised his grace, and journalists were eager to interview him. But that wasn't what concerned him. What lingered in his thoughts was the officer's face, that flicker of doubt, that faint, unspoken regret. Sundar had seen it before, in boardrooms, in classrooms, in immigration counters. That look people gave you when their assumptions collided headfirst with reality. Rather than give interviews or respond to media questions, Sundar did something unusual. He drafted a short private message and had his assistant forward it through the local police department. It read simply, "If you're open to having a conversation, I'd like to invite you to the Google campus, not to reprimand, just to understand." There was no condescension in the words, no passive-aggressive tone, just an open hand. He didn't expect a reply, but a few hours later he received one. "I'll be there. Officer Raymond Carter." When Raymond pulled into the visitor lot at Google's headquarters later that week, he felt like he was entering another world. The clean lines of the architecture, the bicycles neatly arranged, the hum of innovation. It was nothing like his precinct. A young woman greeted him and guided him through a maze of hallways until they arrived at a small glass meeting room. Sundar was already there, dressed just as simply as before, holding 2 mugs of coffee, one of them clearly meant for his guest. The greeting was warm, but unpretentious. Raymond took a deep breath as he sat down, unsure of where to start. "Mr. Pichai." "Please," Sundar interrupted gently. "Just call me Sundar." There was a silence that stretched between them, filled not with tension, but with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Raymond began. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about what I assumed, and I need to say it, I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Sundar nodded slowly. "Thank you. That means more than you know. But I didn't invite you here for an apology. I wanted to talk because what happened between us, it's a moment that can teach us both something." Raymond looked down. "I don't know if people can change just from one conversation." "Maybe not," Sundar replied, "but they can begin to change." Their discussion stretched over an hour, delving into childhoods, belief systems, pressures, and experiences that had shaped their worldviews. Raymond spoke honestly about the challenges of policing, the fears and frustrations, and the institutional norms that sometimes blurred right from wrong. Sundar listened without judgment, and when it was Sundar's turn, he shared his own journey. Son of a clerk in Chennai, riding overcrowded buses to a school without air conditioning, navigating a new life in America as an outsider, proving himself again and again in rooms where he was often the only one who looked like him. By the time they stood to leave, something rare had taken root between them. Not friendship exactly, but understanding. Raymond wasn't just leaving with insight, he was leaving with responsibility. And Sundar, for all his influence and reach, was reminded once again that true change didn't come from algorithms or code, but from people choosing to lean into difficult conversations instead of walking away from them. Later that evening, as Sundar walked the quiet halls of his home, he paused by a large window overlooking the garden. The world outside was still, but inside something profound had shifted. He had extended empathy and it had been received. He had seen the weight of misunderstanding begin to lift from another person, one word at a time. And that mattered, and, somewhere across town, Raymond Carter took off his uniform and sat beside his wife on the porch, watching the sun set slowly behind the hills. He said nothing for a while. Then turning to her, he whispered, "I met the man today, the one I misjudged, and he didn't hate me for it. He forgave me, and gave me something I didn't think I needed, a chance to be better." The story, though still unfolding, was already becoming something larger than a single incident. It was becoming a testament to the power of listening, of grace, and of meeting people not just where they are, but who they are. The echo heard. Around the world, the story that began on a quiet street with flashing police lights and a misunderstanding between 2 men had, within days, transformed into a national conversation. News networks across the country picked up the video, originally posted by a teenager in the crowd, and soon hashtags bearing Sundar Pichai's name trended across social platforms. But it wasn't outrage that fueled this wave. It was reflection. The calm dignity Sundar had displayed in the face of unfair suspicion, the respectful and measured way he had spoken to Officer Carter, and the powerful moment with the young boy had touched something deep within the public conscience. For once, the story wasn't just about the injustice. It was about the possibility of grace, the rare glimpse of what could happen when 2 very different lives met without anger and parted with understanding. In living rooms across America, families watched the clip over dinner. In schools, teachers used it to spark discussions about empathy and judgment. Podcasts featured experts in social behavior, policing, and technology, analyzing the story from every angle. Yet none of these discussions could capture the simple humanity of what had occurred between Sundar and Raymond in that glass-walled room at Google. What stirred the world was not the drama, but the humility. People weren't sharing a story of a tech mogul standing above a police officer. They were sharing the story of a man choosing not to humiliate another, even when he had every opportunity to. Sundar, despite being the epicenter of the conversation, continued about his work quietly. He declined talk show appearances and interview requests. He didn't issue grand statements or orchestrate PR campaigns. Instead, he focused inward, initiating small but meaningful changes within Google's leadership workshops, creating spaces where empathy and social awareness were taught not as optional soft skills, but as foundational qualities of leadership. To him, the true success of that moment wasn't in going viral. It was in inspiring change within systems that often failed to reflect the values people claimed to uphold. He personally reached out to community leaders, educators, and small organizations focused on racial equity and dialogue across divisions, offering support, mentorship, and more importantly, listening. He understood that his role wasn't to speak for others, but to amplify the voices that were often unheard. But while Sundar quietly went about planting seeds of change, Raymond Carter found himself standing on far shakier ground. The police department launched an internal review, not because Sundar pressed charges he didn't, but because public trust had been rattled. Raymond wasn't suspended, but the weight of scrutiny began to affect every part of his life. His fellow officers treated him with a mixture of quiet respect and distant wariness. Some thought he was being unfairly criticized, while others believed he had embarrassed the force. The media labeled him everything from a symbol of systemic failure to a man brave enough to acknowledge his mistakes. And though the headlines buzzed with interpretations, none of them captured the complexity of what he felt within himself. Guilt was there, yes, but so was awakening. A realization that the badge he wore came with not just power, but a profound responsibility to see people clearly, to protect with discernment, and to serve without prejudice. At home, his children had watched the video too. His daughter, now a sophomore in college studying social sciences, called him in tears, not because she was ashamed, but because she saw her father trying. "Dad," she said through choked breaths, "I know it hurt you to see yourself like that, but thank you for not walking away from it. You taught me something real." His son, younger and more unsure, had struggled with the attention. At school, kids whispered, and teachers watched him a little too closely. But one evening, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies dance in the air, he asked, "Dad, do you think people can forgive even if they don't forget?" Raymond didn't answer right away. He put his hand on his son's shoulder and said, "I think people forgive when they see someone trying to become better, not perfect. That's what I'm trying to do." As the media frenzy began to settle, the community surrounding Raymond began to see him in a new light. Not as a villain, not even as a hero, but as a man who took a painful lesson and walked toward it instead of away. He began volunteering at local town halls and listening sessions focused on racial bias and trust in law enforcement. Initially, people were skeptical, even angry, but Raymond didn't come to defend himself. He came to learn. He sat through stories that broke his heart, accounts of traffic stops gone wrong, lives derailed by profiling, voices that trembled with both pain and courage. He took notes, he shook hands, he cried. Slowly, walls began to come down, not entirely, but enough for conversation to take root. One evening, after a particularly raw community meeting, Raymond found an envelope slipped under the door of the precinct. Inside was a handwritten note. It read, "Thank you for not hiding. Thank you for being willing to change. The world doesn't need perfect people, it needs honest ones." There was no signature, but it stayed in his wallet from that day forward. Back at Google, Sundar received a letter too, this one from a group of students at a community college in Detroit. They had seen the video and held a campus discussion inspired by it. The students wrote about how the moment made them feel seen, how Sundar's restraint gave them strength, and how his decision to invite Raymond into dialogue showed them a new kind of leadership, one not built on dominance but on dignity. "You showed us that power doesn't have to shout," one student wrote. "It can whisper and still move mountains." Sundar read the letter alone in his study, the city lights of Silicon Valley glowing quietly beyond the glass. He thought about the chain of events, the morning drive, the flashing lights, the crowd, the boy's question, the officer's face, and marveled at how something so small could ripple into something so vast. He didn't feel heroic. He felt responsible to keep showing up, to keep choosing grace when the world expected anger, to keep building not just companies, but bridges. In the days that followed, Google's diversity training was expanded. More voices were invited to the table. Officer Carter, at Sundar's request, became part of a new civic tech partnership between Google and local departments to train officers in emotional intelligence and cultural awareness. It was unheard of, an officer learning from a tech executive and vice versa. But it was real, it was happening, and it was working. The world didn't need this story to be perfect. It just needed it to be honest. And in the honesty shared between two unlikely men, one who wore a badge and one who wore the weight of the world's expectations, people found hope. Not in grand gestures or dramatic showdowns, but in humility, conversation, and the long, hard, road of change. The story was no longer about a car or a mistaken identity. It was about courage. The courage to face yourself, the courage to forgive, and the courage to rebuild trust one small act at a time. The roots of grace far from the reach of television cameras and online hashtags, there was a dusty street in Chennai, India, where barefoot children chased worn rubber balls and the scent of turmeric and cardamom wafted from open kitchen windows. The sun was harsher there, the concrete less forgiving, but the community was warm, tightly bound by decades of shared struggle. It was in one of the narrow flats along this street that Sundar Pichai had spent his early years, squeezed into two small rooms with his parents and younger brother. They didn't have much, no refrigerator, no television, no car. What they did have was discipline, kindness, and a belief that education was the bridge to a better future. Sundar's father, an electrical engineer who earned just enough to support the family, would take long rides on crowded buses, sometimes walking miles just to afford tuition or new textbooks. And his mother, once a stenographer, gave up her job to raise her sons, insisting they never go to bed without reading something of value, even if it was a torn magazine page or an old newspaper article from months ago. In that small home, Sundar had learned his first lessons in grace, not from lectures or sermons, but from how his parents carried themselves during hardship. When their neighbors fell sick, his mother cooked extra without question. When a child from next door failed his exams, his father spent weekends tutoring him, never asking for a rupee in return. These early acts of quiet dignity shaped Sundar's understanding of strength. It wasn't in shouting, it wasn't in wealth. It was in the choice to give, to forgive, and to keep going when no one applauded you for it. Those values had traveled, with him across oceans, from the crowded schools in Chennai to the university dorms in the United States, and finally to the gleaming halls of the Googleplex. And it was those same values that guided him on that day when Officer Carter had stopped him, not just how he responded, but why he chose to respond that way at all. Now, as the world discussed his grace, analyzed his restraint, and praised his example, Sundar found himself drawn back to those early days more than ever. He spent quiet moments reading old letters from his parents, flipping through faded photographs and remembering what it felt like to be a boy sitting on the floor, dreaming about computers without ever having touched one. He thought about the first time he used a rotary phone, how he'd memorized every digit of its function, and how that obsession with connection had ultimately led him to Silicon Valley. But the deeper truth, the one people often missed, was that his success was never just about intelligence or ambition. It was about perspective. His journey was not built on vengeance or proving others wrong, but on gratitude, humility, and the drive to make things a little better than he found them. That internal reflection took root and began to influence the world around him in ways even he hadn't expected. Students across continents, some in rural villages, others in sprawling cities, began writing essays about Sundar, not just as a CEO but as a role model of modern leadership. At a school in Nairobi, a teenage girl told her teacher she wanted to start a podcast about dignity and identity after watching his viral video. In Sao Paulo, a group of college students organized a digital storytelling festival titled The Better Way, inspired by his quote to the young boy on the street. In Pakistan, Indonesia, and Bangladesh, youth groups shared WhatsApp forwards that translated Sundar's message into local languages so more people could understand it. And in his own home country of India, a public service campaign aired on national radio encouraging empathy in public service, loosely modeled on his story but told in a way that reflected everyday life. Rickshaw drivers helping lost passengers, policemen treating citizens with respect, shopkeepers offering credit to strangers in need. The impact was so widespread and organic that even government officials and lawmakers took notice. Sundar, never one to seek attention for himself, was invited to contribute ideas on how technology could be used to improve community policing, educational equity, and public discourse. But rather than merely draft policy papers or host summits, Sundar did something more lasting. He funded the creation of a platform called Empathy Circles. The initiative aimed to connect students, officers, teachers, and tech professionals in moderated conversations across different regions. The idea was simple: to listen to each other, to learn without attacking, and to discover common ground in stories rather than statistics. The first circle took place in California and included Officer Carter, who volunteered to speak alongside a group of college students, many of whom had never trusted a policeman before. He didn't sugarcoat his past. He admitted to his blind spots, and he told the truth about the moment he judged a man not by who he was but by what he assumed. The conversations were raw, emotional, and sometimes uncomfortable, but they were real, and they were necessary. As more circles formed across cities and schools, Sundar quietly attended a few, not as a guest of honor, but as a listener. He sat in the back, took notes, and spoke only when prompted. What moved him most were the stories shared by young people, those who had grown up mistrusted, overlooked, or treated unfairly because of how they looked or where they came from. He didn't try to fix their pain with solutions or slogans. He simply acknowledged it, and in return, they offered him a rare kind of respect, the respect earned not through titles but through presence. At home, Sundar's children began to notice the change in their father too. Not that he had ever been absent, but something deeper had awakened in him. His daughter, just entering high school, wrote a short story about a man who teaches the world kindness by simply being kind when no one expects him to. When she showed it to him, shy and unsure, he smiled and kissed her forehead. "You saw the real story," he said. His son, younger and more restless, started asking questions about fairness and courage, curious about why his father hadn't been angry that day. "Because anger is easy," Sundar told him one night while tucking him in. "But understanding takes real strength." And even though the news cycle eventually moved on, as it always does, the legacy of the moment did not fade. It lived on in small decisions made in quiet corners of the world. A police officer in Memphis held back judgment during a tense stop, remembering Carter's words. A young intern at a tech company spoke up about inclusivity, inspired by Sundar's silence under pressure. A teacher in a Midwest school added compassion literacy to her curriculum. These weren't headlines, but they were victories nonetheless. Sundar never wrote a book about the incident. He never created a foundation in his name. He believed stories like these belonged not to individuals, but to communities. He once told a friend in passing, "The story didn't happen to me. It happened through me, and hopefully it will keep happening through others." That, in essence, was his philosophy, not to shine, but to reflect light. And so, what began as a routine traffic stop became something far greater. It became a blueprint for leadership in the modern world. A leadership not marked by speeches, dominance, or ego, but by calm presence, open ears, and the ability to choose dignity when judgment comes knocking. From silence to spotlight, in the weeks that followed the viral moment between Sundar Pichai and Officer Raymond Carter, a quiet ripple had grown into a global current. What began as a singular act of restraint was now being unpacked, examined, and expanded upon in forums far beyond what either man could have predicted. From university lecture halls in Berlin to youth activism panels in Cape Town, the story had evolved into a case study, not of conflict but of character. It wasn't just about race or authority anymore. It was about what happens when two people meet at a point of misunderstanding and choose not to ignite the fire, but to extinguish it through grace, humility, and self-inquiry. The world, increasingly saturated with outrage and division, had found something strangely rare in this moment, a display of maturity and mutual transformation in real time. Though Sundar remained cautious about media exposure, the conversation he had started could no longer be confined. Prestigious journals and platforms began inviting social scientists, educators, and human rights thinkers to deconstruct what they called the Pichai method, a non-confrontational, deeply composed way of dismantling bias without amplifying division. His silence had become its own form of communication, and the world leaned in to listen. Even without public speeches or interviews, his actions were beginning to shape policy indirectly. Several cities across North America began reviewing their community engagement models, quietly influenced by the Empathy Circles project. What was once an experimental initiative had taken on a life of its own, with chapters forming in cities across Europe and Asia. For Officer Carter, the journey into this new spotlight was disorienting. He had never spoken at a panel or appeared on national television. His role had always been to observe, intervene, and retreat. But now he was being asked not to enforce law, but to reflect on it, to become a voice of transformation inside a system known for its resistance to introspection. At first he resisted. Every invitation, from nonprofits, academic institutions, and peace-building coalitions, felt like a reminder of his mistake, a reopening of a wound he was still learning to understand. But when he spoke with his daughter about it, she said something that shifted his view. "Dad, maybe the world isn't trying to punish you. Maybe it's trying to give you the chance to teach what you've learned." And so, with hesitation but a sense of purpose, Raymond began speaking, not as an expert, not as a hero, but as a man who had once failed to see someone clearly, and who had chosen not to deny it. His first appearance was modest, a panel hosted by a local university alongside two criminal justice professors and a racial equity advocate. He wore his full uniform but sat without posture or pride, leaning forward to engage rather than to command. He told the story honestly, without deflection. He admitted that the uniform had once made him feel impenetrable, almost untouchable, but that one man's silence had punctured that illusion and revealed the humanity on the other side of the badge. That recording, too, spread. Slowly at first, but then rapidly, because it wasn't a story of guilt. It was a story of change. And people, especially young people, were hungry for real examples of transformation that didn't come from celebrities or scripted apologies. Raymond's voice, steady, slightly gravelly, often pausing to find the right words, became symbolic of something deeply needed in a divided society: the permission to evolve without being erased. Soon, larger institutions took notice. The United Nations Human Rights Council invited him to join a digital roundtable on bias, justice, and the path forward. Raymond, never having left the country, hesitated. But Sundar, ever the quiet guide in the background, called him personally. "You don't have to carry the burden of becoming a symbol," Sundar told him during the call. "You only have to share what's true for you. That's enough." And so, from a small precinct in California, Raymond Carter found himself addressing a global audience through a live stream, his image projected alongside experts and activists from nearly a dozen countries. He didn't use technical terms. He didn't quote books or wave statistics. He spoke plainly. He talked about the pressure of policing, the blinders that form over time, and the day he misread a situation and nearly let that misjudgment define someone else's dignity. And then he spoke about the moment he was forgiven, not with fanfare but with a quiet smile, and how that forgiveness had done something no amount of discipline or training ever could. It made him see again. Not just others, but himself. The response was overwhelming. Emails poured in from places as far as Japan and South Africa, from officers, teachers, students, and parents, thanking him for saying out loud what so many had felt privately. In some messages, people confessed to similar moments of unconscious bias and expressed their fear of being branded forever by a single misstep. Raymond read each one carefully, and in each one he saw a reflection of his own story. Not perfect people, but people trying to be better. Back at Google, Sundar continued to work quietly, declining offers to turn the incident into a corporate campaign or a media series. He knew the moment had its power not because it was curated, but because it was real. Instead, he doubled down on internal initiatives that empowered employees to bring their whole selves into the workplace. He encouraged leaders to be vulnerable in team meetings, to talk about identity, failure, and growth, not as performance, but as practice. He even began a mentorship program, pairing executives with individuals from underserved backgrounds, not to save them, but to listen to them, to understand the obstacles many still face just trying to be seen. Outside the public view, Sundar and Raymond stayed loosely in touch. They didn't become close friends, but they shared a bond that few could understand. Every so often they exchanged short emails, updates on their families, links to articles, or a line or two about how the world was responding. One evening, Raymond sent Sundar a photo from a town hall he had attended where 3 officers cried during a testimony from a teenage boy describing his fear of police. He wrote, "They didn't walk out, they stayed. Maybe that's a start." Sundar replied a day later with a single sentence, "Sometimes, the smallest start holds the deepest promise." And while the world moved on to other news, other controversies, and other cycles of division, this story continued to ripple, quietly, deeply across hearts and minds. A story that wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic, but one that spoke to the possibility that when people meet at the point of their imperfection, something beautiful can still grow from it. What had begun with suspicion evolved into conversation, and matured into change was now entering its final and most fragile phase: legacy. Not the kind written in books or etched into buildings, but the kind passed silently between people, between a father and his children, a teacher and her students, a stranger, and the mirror they faced every day. A legacy built not on titles or trophies, but on moments when someone chose to pause, to see, and to respond not with ego, but with empathy. A legacy, written in silence. Years had passed since that warm Californian morning when Sundar Pichai was stopped by Officer Raymond Carter, an event that at the time had seemed like yet another unfortunate brush with racial profiling. What neither of them realized then was that their brief, tense exchange, followed by their dignified responses, would become the root of something quietly revolutionary. The world had changed since that day, not in sweeping, dramatic ways, but in subtle, consistent ripples that extended into schools, precincts, corporate offices, and even kitchen tables. The moment never hardened into a trending artifact of the past. Instead, it settled gently into the fabric of ongoing conversations, still referenced in classrooms and leadership seminars, still cited in op-eds about empathy and power, still passed along by those who found in it something painfully rare. A model of what it looks like when power meets humility and judgment meets grace. By then, Sundar had stepped into a new phase of life. Though still involved in the tech world, his focus had shifted toward mentoring, humanitarian work, and investing in global education initiatives. He had become somewhat of a philosopher in practice, rarely giving interviews, yet profoundly influential behind the scenes. His foundation, though small compared to many corporate giants, had helped over 100 community schools across continents incorporate emotional intelligence into their curricula. These weren't flashy programs with celebrity endorsements. They were carefully designed learning environments that taught children how to listen, how to understand each other, how to take responsibility, and how to recover with dignity when they erred. Sundar's philosophy was embedded in every page of the teaching materials, not as his own words, but through the spirit of stories that encouraged compassion over conquest, courage over cruelty, and patience over reaction. And then there was Raymond. The man once defined by a single mistake now stood as a symbol of a different kind of courage, the courage to stand still in the face of public judgment, to absorb the truth of your failure, and to begin the long work of becoming a better version of yourself. He had retired from the police force with honor, but not before helping establish an internal peer reflection unit in his department, encouraging officers to discuss the emotional toll of their work and confront their own biases in a structured, non-punitive setting. Many had resisted the idea at first, believing it to be too soft or unnecessary, but over time it became one of the department's most respected programs, credited for diffusing multiple high-stress situations on the street simply because officers had learned to pause, breathe, and choose empathy. Raymond didn't take credit. He never wanted his name on plaques or his photo on posters. He just wanted officers to leave the force better than they entered it. In his final week, he was asked what moment defined his career. He looked out a nearby window and simply said, "The one where I said nothing, and someone showed me everything." Despite the passage of time, Sundar and Raymond kept in touch, irregularly, without ceremony, but always with sincerity. They met once a year for coffee, always at the same small cafe run by the elderly couple who had been there on that first day. Mr. and Mrs. Patel were older now, their steps slower, their voices softer, but they remembered every detail of that morning. They never treated Sundar as a celebrity, nor Raymond as a fallen officer redeemed. To them, they were two men who had done something beautiful in a moment of tension. They had listened. During these visits, the four of them would sit quietly, sipping chai, talking about the world, about aging, about the headlines they tried to ignore, and about the stories that reminded them goodness still thrived in quiet corners. One particular afternoon during one of these visits, a young woman approached their table. She was a schoolteacher from the area, just passing through. But when she recognized Sundar and Raymond, her eyes filled with tears. She introduced herself and explained that the video of their encounter, which she had watched during her college years, had changed the course of her life. "I was angry all the time," she admitted, her voice shaking. "Angry at the system, at the world, at the people who didn't see me. But then I saw the way you both chose not to add to the fire. You didn't excuse the mistake, but you built something from it. It made me want to teach differently, to be better, not bitter." Sundar smiled and gestured for her to sit, offering her part of his seat at their modest table. "That's the real legacy," he said softly. "Not what happens in front of a camera, but what people do with it afterward." And truly, that had become the lasting echo of their moment. In the years since, an entire generation had grown up watching that video in school assemblies, listening to professors discuss it in ethics courses, and seeing it used in leadership workshops around the world. It wasn't dramatic or cinematic. There were no explosions, no shouting, no victorious music swelling in the background. There was just a man being wrongly accused, choosing dignity, and another man realizing his bias and choosing to change. That was all. And somehow it was more powerful than any speech or summit or strategy ever could be. Even long after the internet stopped circulating the clip, the values it represented lived on. A young officer in New Zealand, stopping a teenager, recalled Raymond's testimony and approached with calm. A girl in Mumbai, faced with bullying in her school, remembered Sundar's quiet strength and responded not with retaliation, but with compassion. An executive in Berlin, facing public backlash over a misjudged campaign, chose to issue a sincere apology and initiate open dialogue, citing the Sundar Carter incident as his inspiration. These weren't just reactions, they were reverberations. Proof that the right choices, even when made in silence, don't vanish. They travel, they teach. They leave behind invisible threads that tie people together across languages, borders, and beliefs. In the end, the story of Sundar Pichai and Officer Raymond Carter was not one of perfection or performance. It was the story of two flawed, complex men caught in a difficult moment who chose not to escalate but to evolve. It was a story about what it means to own your influence and what it means to own your error. It was a reminder that every interaction, no matter how brief, holds the potential to become a mirror, a lesson, or a seed. And perhaps that's what made it unforgettable, not its virality, but its vulnerability. As they sat together, one last Undari time at the cafe, with the sun dipping low behind the trees and the evening breeze rustling the jasmine outside the window, Sundar and Raymond exchanged a look. No words were needed. They had lived the story that others only wrote about. They had become part of something greater than themselves. Not heroes, not martyrs, just two men who had seen each other clearly in a moment that could have gone so differently. And that clarity, that choice to rise above, would outlive them, in the minds and hearts of those who would carry it forward. The world didn't change because they tried to change the world. The world changed because in a single moment two men changed themselves and let others see how it was done. The quiet revolution time has a way of softening the edges of sharp moments. What once felt urgent becomes a lesson. What once burned brightly fades into something deeper. Memory, wisdom, foundation. And so it was with the story of Sundar Pichai and Officer Raymond Carter. The world had moved forward, as it always does, cycling through news and noise, clamor and distraction. But beneath the surface of daily life, in communities stretched across continents, something quiet and transformational had continued to grow. A revolution not of fire or protest, but of hearts reshaped through observation, through reflection, through choosing a better way when the lesser way beckoned. In a village school tucked deep in the hills of northern India, a young boy stood at the front of his class holding a handmade poster. On it were two simple sketches, one of a man behind the wheel of a car and the other of a policeman standing beside him, his hand raised not in force but in pause. The title read, "Choose Understanding." When asked why he made the poster, the boy smiled and said, "Because my teacher told me about a man who didn't get angry when he was wrongly stopped. He showed the world how to stay calm. I want to be like him." Across the world, in a university in Atlanta, a group of law students had formed a study circle. They called it Courageous Conversations. Every week they gathered to discuss landmark cases and ethical dilemmas. The first case they had ever studied wasn't found in law textbooks. It was a viral incident pulled from the internet. Sundar Pichai, in a moment of racial misjudgment, choosing dignity instead of outrage. And that moment, simple yet profound, became the lens through which they examined accountability, humility, and reform, not in theory, but in practice. Meanwhile, Officer Raymond Carter, though now retired, found himself invited to speak in unexpected places. He had never intended to be a public figure. Yet his name, his presence, and most of all, his transparency had become a living classroom for those struggling with the burden of past errors. He no longer wore his uniform. He no longer introduced himself with rank or credentials. Instead, he began every talk the same way. "I once judged a man by what I thought I saw, but the man I saw didn't judge me back. He gave me space to change. That space changed my life." The audience always fell silent at those words, not because they were polished or rehearsed, but because they were real. Not every person in the room agreed with him. Some still carried pain, distrust, and frustration. But they listened. And in that listening, the first thread of reconciliation was often sown. But the most unexpected transformation unfolded not on podiums or classrooms, but in the cultural mindset of millions. Because the story hadn't just stayed within social boundaries. It had quietly influenced corporate boardrooms, content creators, writers, even filmmakers. There was a new kind of storytelling taking root, one that replaced heroes who conquered with heroes who composed themselves. Scripts began to change. A-list actors pushed for nuanced roles that showcased restraint as a form of power. Films, no, longer celebrated only the loudest characters but began to give space to those whose greatest triumphs were emotional control, wisdom, and grace under pressure. This shift wasn't orchestrated by Sundar or Carter. They never claimed ownership. In fact, neither of them spoke publicly about the widespread changes attributed to their moment. And that was the point. Influence that is sincere does not need a microphone. It travels in the hands of others, teachers, artists, activists, students, who carry it forward in their own unique voices. Sundar, for his part, had become a mentor to global youth leaders. He launched a program that paired teenagers from underserved communities with innovators across industries, allowing them to work on passion projects guided by real-world mentors. The program didn't teach technology as much as it taught integrity, how to create responsibly, how to lead ethically, and how to listen deeply. He gave opening remarks once a year at their virtual summit, always choosing stories over statistics, vulnerability over status. His final speech before stepping away from the program simply said, "Your legacy isn't what you build, it's how you behave when no one expects you to be watching." In one of the final interactions between Sundar and Raymond, an impromptu meeting at a small educational conference, they sat alone under a tree behind the venue, away from flashing cameras and curious spectators. Raymond, now visibly older, with grayer hair and deeper lines on his face, turned to Sundar and asked something that had been resting in his heart for years. "Do you ever regret forgiving me so quickly, so easily?" Sundar smiled gently, not in amusement but in affection. He took a slow breath before answering, "It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Not for you, for me. Carrying anger makes everything heavier. I've had to carry enough in my life. Forgiveness lets me put it down." Raymond nodded, his eyes wet. "I still carry it, you know. That day?" "I know," Sundar replied. "That's why you're different now. Because you don't run from it. You grow from it." And there it was, closure not in a grand declaration, but in a quiet exchange between two men who had changed the shape of a narrative not through war, not through resistance, but through presence, perspective, and persistence. Long after both men moved into new chapters of their lives, their story continued to teach. It was no longer about Sundar or Raymond. It was about every individual who had once been misjudged and chose not to become bitter. Every authority figure who once misstepped and chose not to defend their ego, but to repair the breach. It was about the possibility of a world where leadership is measured not by how loudly you speak, but by how deeply you listen. A world where the most powerful choice is not reaction, but reflection. The world would always have conflict. There would always be misunderstanding, injustice, and pain. But this story stood as a monument to the truth that even in such moments, people can choose to interrupt the pattern. They can slow down the machinery of judgment and insert humanity in its place. And when they do, the world shifts, even if only by an inch. Even if only in the heart of one child, one officer, one student, one teacher. That inch matters. Because inch by inch the world is made. And so, as years passed and the initial moment became history, the story of Sundar and Raymond became legend, not because it was extraordinary, but because it reminded people that the ordinary can be extraordinary when it is handled with grace. Their names would fade from the headlines. Their faces might be forgotten by future generations. But the choice they made in one fleeting encounter, the choice to see each other as human, would continue to echo. Not a story of what happened, but a story of what could happen. When people choose to see beyond assumption, to speak beyond pride, and to lead beyond themselves, that is how real revolutions begin.